So let me start this video by stating up front, this is a task best left to a machine shop. Right? I hope I satisfied, all little like the Dudley Do-Rights out there, okay? This is truly best left to a machine shop. But there are some situations, some circumstances where you're going to want to swap a connecting rod, set of pistons or whatever, and the machine shop's 200 miles away, or it's closed, or whatever it happens to be, or you just want to be able to do it yourself at home. So I'm going to show you how to swap a pressed piston and rod assembly using just a torch. Your first step, obviously, is removing the old piston from the piston and rod assembly that you've got. There's a couple of ways you can do this. If you have a press and you're not concerned with saving the piston, well then put it in the press and drive the pin out. If you don't have a press, your way to go with this is to chuck the piston up in a soft jaw vise. If you don't have a soft jaw vise, just take a paint stirrer stick, break it in half, and stick it between the jaws of the vise and the piston, and you will not hurt the piston. Then take your MAP gas torch and heat the rod, just like this. Get it to where it's just barely a dull red. And then you take, let's say on this particular setup, you take a 1/2-inch drive extension, put the 1/2-inch drive extension in there, and just tap, tap, tap while the rod is still hot, and you'll drive the pin out. Really not much science to it. Do not attempt this on a lightweight, thin wall wrist pin. You will destroy the wrist pin. You'll destroy its integrity, I should say. But on these street pins, these big, giant, clunky street pins, you're not going to hurt it. You may discolor the outside of it a little bit, but you're not going to actually weaken the pin doing it. As far as heating the connecting rod, this is crucial, okay? Now, I say leave this to a machine shop, because here's what happens now. A machine shop uses a forge. They have a rod forge, and it's specifically to put the rod in and heat the small end of the rod to get the pinhole to expand and then allow the pin to slide through. What you're looking for is a very, very dull red. You're not looking for cherry red. You're not looking to have the heat come all the way up the shank of the rod. All you're looking for is just a dull red pin area. Now, before I do that, before I demonstrate that, when you're dealing with the bottom end of an engine, everything has an exact spec, right? Oil clearances, main and rod bearing clearances, side clearances on the rod, thrust clearance on the crank. Everything has an exact spec to the 100,000th of an inch. Not this. When you're talking about pressing pins into rods, pistons, there is no exact spec. And here's a pretty good example. This is a factory assembly. This is from a 383 Chrysler, okay? And this is the way it was done from the factory. Now, if I center the pin, if I take my fingers and I center the pin in the piston, so now I have equal amounts, and I double checked this and triple checked it. If I have equal amounts of the pin sticking out of the sides of the piston, the rod is offset probably 50 or 60 thousandths of an inch. Right? It's really not a precision thing. And it doesn't have to be a precision thing. As long as it's not hanging all the way out one end or anything like that. This is one of those situations where close enough is good enough. So you want to make sure before you even start this that you know where the pin is going to ride in the piston. So I use my fingers as a gauge. The pin sticks out of the piston. I mean, whatever it happens to be. If I was to measure that, it's probably around 60, 70, 80 thousandths of an inch on either side. You just want to have that feel for it. So when you clamp the piston like this in your hand, you've got the pin centered. You know where it's going to lie. All right, so that said, the first thing we do is put the piston in position, or put the pin in position, just like this. So it's just hanging off the one side of the piston. Next, you want to make sure orientation is correct. So pistons, factory pistons, all have an offset built into them. And any piston that has an offset has a directional notch, like this one right here. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that your directional notch is in the right orientation with the rod. So in this case, our directional notch is going to be to our right, okay? And when I look at this piston and rod assembly with the directional notch to the right, I see that the tangs of the rod, right here, are facing outwards. So, we look for our directional notch here. Here's our directional notch on this piston. It's to the right. And when we line this rod up with it, we're going to want to make sure that the tangs, right here, are going to be in the correct orientation. So it's going to go in this way. All right. Now, heating the pinhole of the connecting rod. You want to do this evenly and slowly. It'll generally take 3 or 4 minutes of passing the heat around before you start to see it turn. And what you're looking for here is just a dull red. You don't want this thing cherry red. That'll hurt the rod. But you want it to be just a dull red, and you want to keep your heat centered around that pinhole and get it even. As a good gauge, when you hold the rod, hold it from the shank here. If it starts to get hot enough, too hot to handle, you know you've gone too far. Getting close. But one of the things you might want to do before you do this is put the pin in a freezer. Get the pin as cold as possible. The colder it is, the more contracted it is. And you notice I'm holding the rod by its shank, and my fingers aren't feeling any heat. And I'd say we're almost there now. All right, so I'm going to give this a shot. Give the pin a squirt. Orientation is correct. And that's it. Now I've got the pin centered by finger here. Okay. And there's our rod. Now again, see, if you're off by a couple of thousandths of an inch, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. As long as you've got, let's say in this case, the pin overhangs the outside of the piston by, 50, 60, 70 thousandths of an inch, as long as you can feel the pin to the outside and you've got your rod centered, you're good to go. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Let this thing cool naturally. Don't quench it. Don't do anything like that. Just let it cool, natural room temperature, and you're done. That simple. But again, like I said, if you're unsure of yourself with this, bring it to a machine shop. And that's it. I'll see you tomorrow.